Alrighty, so we're going to start now. Just let everybody settle down. There might be a couple that come in the back, but they can quietly join us at the back. So we are doing our branding workshop today, and we're really pleased to welcome Vanessa Richmond here today. We're going to do a test to see if we can do this without a microphone.
Yeah.
We're hoping that that's going to work well. We did another event here without it. Everybody at the back, can you hear okay? Right? Okay, we'll try
10
that.
out of 10 or like 8 out of 10?
Yeah,
fine.
Okay, fantastic.
Okay, great.
All right. So for those of you that don't know me, I'm Shannon Bard. I lead the Climate Venture Studio at Entrepreneurship at UBC. So we really focus on how we can take inventions that are in the university and work with scientist entrepreneurs to launch them into society as quickly as possible. And the timeline historically is 30 years. Wow. So we want to change that, which means we have to do things differently, to try to get it down to 5 to 10 years. And part of how we do that is help to do technology market matching, to work with regulators to remove inadvertent barriers to market. If there's prescriptive regulations that say only technology that we can actually use to get an environmental permit, that means nothing new can ever be used. So we work with them to sort of overcome these things. But part of how we do that is around storytelling. And so Vanessa and I met when the CEO, who's our old EIR at Entrepreneurship at UBC, and who helped me develop the Climate Venture Studio, Paul Needham. He's now the CEO of Arca Climate, had been working with Vigilantes and with Vanessa for their rebranding. And often these very highly technical concepts and inventions, it's difficult to communicate what you're doing and what the impact is and why other people should care about it to a lay audience. And so they had had such a great experience with Vanessa, and then I found out that another team that we had worked with, Vivo. So Arca Climate, for those of you that aren't familiar with, is a company that comes out of the Earth Sciences Mining Department, Greg Dippel's lab, and they're able to take a certain kind of rock that is in high abundance at nickel, where there's nickel deposits, where you have nickel mines, in the tailings, so the waste rock, and they can actually capture and sequester carbon dioxide from the air and turn it into more rock. So they've been able to do that, and again, trying to explain that to people can be a little bit complex. The business case can be a bit complex, and then this biotechnical pharma company that has been working with Vigilantes, Vivo, they also did a rebranding, and what they're doing is they are they're trying to make blood typing obsolete, so that your blood or your organs could be transplanted to anyone without having concerns about not having the same blood type and having rejection. And so that's a really transformational thing, but again, it's a very technical, very specialized language, and doing the storytelling around that can be really challenging. So Vanessa was really helpful in being able to sort of rebrand their approach and be able to communicate things to investors, to general audiences. And so I wanted to bring her in to talk to all of you about why storytelling is important and what is branding, and how can that be sort of positive for what we want to do when our goal is to make impact. Oh, you should want to advance. So I just wanted to acknowledge that we're, because we're here in Robson Square, we are on the coast of Ocean People traditional lands, and of course we want to acknowledge that we're here, and we're really gracious that we get to live here and get to work here and make impact here. And a lot of the work that we do is in collaboration with First Nations, because a lot of the impactful work we can do in climate and in health and on the social side can actually help not only strengthen communities, but strengthen land sovereignty for First Nations. So if you can, for example, help a remote First Nation get off diesel, because you can get introduction of renewable energy and have ways to store it, then that secures your land tenure and your land sovereignty, because people can live there and work there and go to school, and there's healthcare and other things. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to make up with at Entrepreneurship at UBC. So what we're going to learn about today is why brands matter, why storytelling is important, and talk about sort of the difference between a founder story and what the brand story might be. And Vanessa's going to take us through that journey.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's so lovely to be here talking to you. Thank you for coming on your lunch hour in this room to meet together and talk. I thought I'd start by telling you a little bit about who I am and then move into what we're going to talk about today, because they are related, which is probably good. If I was a dentist, you'd be like, okay, why are we here? I am a story writer. I tend to write stories about other people. Sometimes I write them about myself, but mostly about others. Here's where that started. My parents moved from England to a Calgary suburb named Silver Springs. I mean, what else would be called Silver Springs other than a suburb? So there we were, and our neighbor across the street, Ron, used to get up in the morning, put his suit on, put his cowboy boots and his Stetson on, and get into his Ford Bronco and drive into work in those big towers downtown in Calgary because he worked in oil. And I felt like every other man on the block basically was the same. And his wife Marlene managed the home, and she drove a wood panel station wagon, which I still have a fondness for. Who doesn't, let's be honest. And my dad had grown up and left school early. He worked as a steel worker in North Yorkshire. But he was in the basement writing a PhD in art education. Obviously, that's a longer story. My mom was a teacher at elementary school, and I went to French school out of area. I was an alien. I mean, I'm weird now, but I was weirder then. And it was hard. It was hard being that 4-year-old in Silver Springs. And I remember my parents started watching Dallas on the Friday nights. Does anyone even know what Dallas is? Is anyone old enough? Thank you. Thank you very much. It's almost like, let's say you are from another country and you suddenly end up living next door to Donald Trump. Pretend it's Mar-a-Lago. It's not, this story doesn't work, but just pretend. And then pretend one night you discover Succession. And you're like, oh. So I started watching Dallas, and I was like, J.R. Ewing, Sue Ellen, they can explain the world to me. And I started watching Dallas like it was the truth, like it was gospel. And it's about then that I started feeling like stories can save lives. So I went through school and I graduated, and I decided I wanted to be a writer. And I told my parents about that. And they said, darling, because obviously they're British, we're a bit concerned. And I was like, oh, like what? It's valid. When I leave the house, I can never find my keys. They were worried I'd be in a war zone. They were like, this is not a job for our daughter. So I followed in their footsteps, and I became a high school English teacher, and it was great. It was a really good job. I've heard it described as the best job in the world and the worst job in the world. I don't know if you know any teachers. Anyway, I was a teacher, and pretty soon, what I realized is that the kids, some kids were really good in class discussion. You remember that from high school? Some kids are just good at it. And they were good at getting out of a hot mess when the dog ate their homework, when they were talking to them. They just knew how to kind of tell a story, be a bit funny, get people on side. And I got kind of interested in this. I was like, is this innate or is this learned? And I believed, and I still do, that it is learned. We learn to tell a good story. And along the way we get encouraged, and we tell even more. So around that time, I started coaching the public speaking and debating team. I know you're seeing me in a new light now, aren't you? You're like, oh, I didn't realize she's cool. Yeah, I did. I coached the debate team at the school I was teaching at, and I loved it. And we ran stories. That's basically what we did in a competitive way. You learned to tell your story and then go and compete against other people trying to make a case for something. So one of the students I coached ended up going to the World Public Speaking and Debating Championship. That's right. It's kind of like the Stanley Cup of debating. Thousands of people in the stands, in my mind. In reality, of course, I was the only one in the room. But it was really inspiring to me. And the winner of the debate championship was my student. Her name is Sarah Mortzarvi. And I made a documentary about her for the CBC called The Terminator. She used to listen to Metallica on her way into the room. She was fierce. And she could tell a story about almost anything, find facts and proof, and then argue the exact opposite 5 minutes later. She was a marvel. And it's because she worked hard. And that was a revelation to me. After about 5 years of teaching, I left to become a writer. I still had wanted to become a writer. So I became a writer, and I started out by writing about youth culture, and then pretty soon I started writing about pop culture. And pretty soon I had a column. It was called Schlock and Awe. And what I would do is I would find something that had happened in the news, generally that week, or in pop culture of some kind, a TV show, one that was popular, a scientist in the news, something that sort of sparked my interest. And I would call smart people to help me unpack what was happening. In most cases, those were academics. Sometimes in the humanities, sometimes science, sometimes business. But I'd say, hey, can you help me understand what's happening with this thing that's going on? I had this naive question. And this person who had spent sometimes 10,000 hours, sometimes more, would explain it to me. I mean, it was like a dream. They had figured it out. And they told me about it. It was the greatest luxury. And sometimes they would help me identify a new problem. Sometimes they would tell me about a discovery or an innovation that they had themselves made or were working on. And what was really interesting is sometimes these people had been in the media before, but mostly they had not. Mostly, I was the first person who had ever asked them about their work in the media. And in many cases, I was the last. In many cases, they were never in the media at any other time that I know of. I mean, their lives aren't over. They may still be in the media more. I started to feel pretty discouraged about humanity when I would think about the fact that people were spending their whole lives thinking about something and their story wasn't getting out there. Sometimes I almost wanted to collectively shake humanity and be like, this is an idea that could improve things for us. This could change the world. This could change your life. Why aren't you listening? And then I remember J.R. Ewing. And I was like, we pay attention to good stories. It's not enough to have thought of something that can change the world. You need cowboy boots. No, you need some way to tell other people about it in a way that inspires them. That part is as important as the invention or the discovery itself. So around that time, I started to work for some advertising and design agencies, partly because writing for independent media outlets about academics didn't pay that well. I know you're surprised. But I did, and I would, in most cases, go in and start working with a company. And I would go in, and I would try to find out their story. I would try to find out, why did you start this? What are you hoping to change? What matters about this to you? What makes you different from the other people doing this? Because I was trying to write a feature story about them, basically. I was trying to listen to all the things they told me were interesting, which rarely were. And I was trying to listen for what actually was interesting that I could use to talk about. So after a few years of doing this, I started working for another agency in town called Burn Kit. And there was a creative director there who had come from Grey Worldwide, which is a big agency. He was from Germany. And when I told him that this is what I was doing, he was like, oh, well, this is not correct. I mean, obviously, right? And he said, what you're trying to do is you're trying to build a brand. And he put me onto a whole bunch of resources that helped me see that there was a whole methodology for this. I didn't have to write a feature story about them as if it was a magazine. There's a way to help people identify what makes a good story. So he and I ended up founding an agency. It's called Vigilantes. And we set out to work entirely with purpose-driven companies trying to have some kind of good impact on humanity, who in most cases are also running a business, though not always, who are mostly terrible at telling their stories. And we try to help them tell their stories so they can have the impact they're looking for. That's where this came from. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about today. I wanted, oh, we've already done number one, the introduction. We're a quarter of the way through. I wanted to talk to you, and I know you can't see this yellow, a little bit about what I call Story 101, which to me is 4 ingredients that make a really good founder story. Then we're going to switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to tell you about the difference between a story and a brand. I would imagine that almost no one in this room is ready for a brand, But I believe that if you know what it is and you can start thinking about it, you can in your mind be getting ready for it, and that in itself will give you some advantages, because by the time you get there, you'll be more ready. Most importantly, I want to take your questions at the end. So I'm going to try to keep track of time because I'm a talker. You had no idea, right? I know. So I don't know if you can see this. I wanted to ask you if everybody in this room would write down a question. Here's why. I do a lot of these talks. Again, I love speaking. And people email me later, often many people, and they say, you know what, the question didn't occur to me until now. So what I want to ask you is, could you force yourself to identify one question as I'm talking? Because that way you can ask here, and I think you'll get a better answer. And then you can also email me later, but your brain will be going, and we'll get the benefit of the thing you want to know about. Other people can hear about it too. So I used to be a teacher. I do cruelly call on people randomly, but I ask you not to force me to do that.
2 requests really quick.
Yeah.
Either I'm colorblind or something is wrong
I
with my
know.
eyes. I can't see the yellow text. Can you read that out first, please?
Oh, I'd be happy to. Yeah, and I didn't calibrate the monitor. I usually do these talks with a creative director who's much more technically adept than I did, and I should have noticed that, and I didn't do it. This just says write your questions, and thanks for asking. So we're going to start by talking about story. This is a frog, in case you didn't know that. And I put this frog here because at Vigilantes, we just went out and we did about 24 interviews with our target, which is CEOs of established companies, CEOs and founders of startups. Purpose-driven in all cases, and we also talked to VCs, private equity firms, and their advisors. We were basically doing what you do here at UBC, which is trying to find out what jobs are they trying to do, what pains do they have, because that helps us understand how do we actually serve people better. So what was really interesting to me is that without exception, when I went through all the transcripts, there was one thing that stood out as being the most important thing in all cases, and that was the idea that the CEO or the founder's job is to get people in, to get people on side. And one put it that she spent all of her time trying to inspire potential investors, potential partners, granting bodies, other scientists, the public, the media, and her team. She said, my job is all about inspiring. Show of hands, how many of you feel like that in some way or another, that it's your job to get people on side or inspire them? Okay, great. For a minute you hesitated and I was like, okay, the research bunk. One CEO who came through this program about 5 years ago and ended up selling his company for $118 million, which seems like a very large number to me. When I talked to him, he said, you have to kiss a lot of frogs to find your prince. So what he said his role was as the CEO of his company was to tell the story all the time to everyone. He said his job was frog kissing. We cannot, as founders or CEOs, go out and tell the story once and get that $10 million investment and be done. It doesn't work that way. But interestingly, it's often by telling the story to people who are frogs that something good happens. They give us a piece of the puzzle, or they're bored, which is in itself really instructive. They give us a piece of feedback, they connect us to somebody else, they tell us about a program, something happens, and that is very useful to us. So we don't get to just tell the story once in like a blaze of glory. We have to tell it all day, every day, and that's actually a very useful thing. So the first thing I wanted to talk about stories is that it is our main job, and it's important to think about it as our main job. Not just something off the side of our desk that we do when we're not doing the most interesting thing. Our job is to bring people in. The next thing, and this is called the simplicity paradox, is something I realized about all the scientists that I was working with. And I listened to his podcast that Neil deGrasse Tyson was on, so I went out and I read his book, which is called Starry Messenger, Cosmic Perspectives on Civilization. He just came out with it. He is lovely. I don't know if you've ever, yeah, people are nodding. How many people have heard of Neil deGrasse? He's marvelous. He's marvelous. So I paraphrased here, and really his idea is that scientists are a very special breed. So when they go to a conference, they just start by reading out their facts and their data, and this is normal behavior. But when they get together to have a conversation with another scientist, one of them will state that they've made some sort of new discovery, they give their proof points, and the other one will either agree and give a reason, or they will disagree and they will give a reason. And then the first scientist will say, aha, yes, I can see that you're right, or they will say, no, here's another piece of proof. And they'll go on like that until either they have agreed or until, in Neil deGrasse Tyson's words, they realize they need more data and then they have a beer. Like if there's any hope for civilization, it is in scientific communication. However, when a scientist speaks to a non-scientist, there couldn't be a greater fail. Even though I'm a diehard fan of science, if a scientist reads from an academic paper to me, despite desperately wanting to understand, despite being a communicator for a living, despite listening and trying, I am generally lost within a sentence or two. I'm sorry to any scientists in the room. But what I would add is that also happens with any kind of expert. And one of the reasons is, and you know about this because you're in the business of innovation, whether you're a scientist or not, when you get involved in something that not many other people know about, you start to become interested in things that nobody else understands and that nobody else is interested in. That's partly what interests you about it. You're discovering these new things that are new to you and compelling. The problem is, you've spent 30 years with this, or 20, or 10 years, or you just joined the startup 6 months ago. But when you talk to people, that's what you want to tell them about, because that's what's exciting to you. And we've already established that your main job is to inspire others into what you're doing, and that your expertise is a direct threat to that. It goes against what you actually need to achieve. Because when you say things people don't understand, you turn them off, you don't bring them in. And the simplicity paradox is that, interestingly, what brings people in is finding a way to make it simpler. That's what we have to do. When a lot of scientists come to me, they come to me because they have been told by somebody that they have to. Michelle and I know each other. What they usually say to me is a variation of the following. I've been told I have to dumb it down, or I've been told I've got to make my work fluffy. In almost every case, when there's an expert of any kind, that's something I hear. But ironically, that doesn't work. In fact, the only form of simplicity that works is when you somehow retain the integrity of what is actually fascinating about it, but you find a way to make it accessible to other people. Dumbing it down is a bit like imagining you went to see your favorite band and they got up on stage and they just kind of sang the lyrics like this. They just kind of did it. They made it dumb. They made it simple. It doesn't work. It doesn't bring anybody in. Making it dumb is the opposite of what you need to do. I was actually talking to a VC the other day. I told him this great number of things that I actually found confusing myself. And he summed them up for me in these 2 sentences that I thought were brilliant. I said, that's a real skill that you have, reducing something complex into something simple. I said, I think it's one of the highest forms of thinking. And he thanked me, and he said he actually had a conversation last week with someone who said, oh, what's your superpower? And Xander said to him, well, I'm pretty good at reducing complex things into simple ones. He said, oh, you're good at paraphrasing. Xander was like, so one of the hardest things is to get it simple. And I'm telling you this not to discourage you, but to encourage you. So that if currently you have the sense that you're telling the story and people aren't getting it, you wonder if maybe your innovation can't be explained, what I would like to tell you is it's extremely hard work. That's why you haven't arrived at it yet, but that doesn't mean you won't. It means you need to apply some skill and practices and get there, and you will. If there is something about it that excites you, there is a way to excite other people about it. So one thing to think about when you are starting to craft your story, and this is the third thing, is that there are formulas that you can start with. You do not need to reinvent the wheel. Over time, you can start to craft your story in your own way, but you can start somewhere. Other people, just like the example I gave you of academics who've spent their whole lives thinking about something, storytellers have spent their whole lives thinking about mechanics that let us tell stories. So one CEO I talked to told me there is a kind of formula, and to him, he said, and I'm going to tell you about Pixar in a second, he said, a startup story in every case needs to be like a kind of Marvel movie. He said, you've got to start with an origin story, not like the year you started it, but like where you were when something actually inspired you. And he was like you were 12 and your dad got cancer and it made you want to find a cancer drug. He's like, I'm being kind of cynical, but there is some sort of catalyst that got you into it. He said, and then the next part is about the enormity of the problem. He said there needs to be some big Al Gore kind of graph. He said then, after hard nights in the lab, you make a discovery and it either changes consumer behavior or you find a cure for something. And then there's the solution. And then there's this brave new world that we're going to get to, and there's hope at the end. And I like that because he essentially found his own structure. But there are established structures. Interestingly, almost every fairy tale has been analyzed to have the same structure. It's called a ring structure. And Umberto Eco actually did quite a bit of work on James Bond, who fascinated him, and he wrote down the formula for a James Bond story or a James Bond movie. So there are a lot of these, whether we know it or not. And that's what happened to Emma Coates, who was a story artist at Pixar. Pixar, as I'm sure you know, it's an animation studio based in California. People have heard of Pixar? Yeah, okay. It was formed by George Lucas, turned around by Steve Jobs. Story, WALL-E, Up are just her examples. And Emma Coates started by analyzing some of the movies before her, and she found they all had this similar structure. And it's now being used by the rest of the movies quite explicitly, but also by a lot of people. And here's how it goes. Once upon a time, that means you fix the beginning of the story in a particular time and place with a particular person and where they are or when they are or whatever detail about that makes sense. The job here isn't to write down everything, you'd be here all year, but it's to find a couple of those details from the beginning that matter. Every day. Now, this is about what is the character's world like before the adventure that's coming. Again, you don't need to belabor this. Sometimes you've got 1 minute, sometimes you've got 15, but some sort of what their life was like, and then one day is the change moment. It's the beginning of the adventure. In The Hobbit, it's when Gandalf knocks on Frodo's door, Bilbo's door. If you're the CEO in the other narrative, it's the day your dad got cancer. But what is that inciting incident, that change moment that calls you to the beginning of something? Because of that, there's a twist along the way. The road is not simple. Imagine the Romeo and Juliet story without any obstacles. It doesn't work. What got in the way that you had to overcome? What was difficult? And then finally, the solution, the closure, what creates the equilibrium again, and most important, what will the future now be like? Where's the hope? Where's the emotion? What can we now strive towards? It's very simple. And if you write your story out in that way and think about it in that way, it can cause you to add some ingredients that you're currently missing because you're focusing mostly on the facts and the details. The founders and the CEOs that I have worked with who have been successful use a kind of story, but more importantly, they practice it hundreds of times. Paul Needham talks frequently about how much time he spent practicing the story. So did the other CEOs. They will tell it to friends and family, they tell it to their accountant, they tell it to their dentist. They go to conferences and they go to the networking part of it almost specifically to try it out on people. They watch their faces for micro expressions. Where do they get it? Where are they excited? Where are they with me? Where are they bored? Where are they confused? Where are they annoyed? Where are they spacing out? They take note of that. Sometimes they even write down that note in their phone. Or they say something for the first time in a conversation. That happens too, like, ooh, I don't know where that came from, but I'm gonna write that down, that was good. And then they fix it, and they try again. And they get to a place where they're like, I've got the story, and I can do it in a minute, 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 3 minutes, 20 minutes, half an hour. I know what the story is. I know what I say to people to explain what I'm doing that gets them in, that gets them on side. So my third thing is that there's a formula. It's available for every story, and it takes practice to nail it. And finally, there's something called the pulse test. This one for me comes from a time when I was the managing editor at the Tyee, and I was young then. And I was in charge of buying stories for the life section and the culture section. And I was new, and I wanted to try really hard because I'm a keener nerd. And so I was going through all the pitches we got, and I would get dozens a week, and I would go to the story meeting, which was with 7 men, and I would sit down and I had all my notes and my highlighters and my paper clips, which I thought would help me. And I remember saying one week, these are the reasons I think our readers are really gonna like this story. And I was like getting ready to go through them. I was like totally organized. And the editor looked at me, he said, I'm not paying you to tell me what you think our readers will like. It's like I can get that anywhere. I'm paying you to tell me which stories got you excited, which ones raised your pulse. He said, that's the only measure there is. You're a person, and what affects you, chances are will affect somebody else. That's the only measure. Does it affect you? He said, go back, read the pitches, come back and tell me which ones excited you. I was like, okay, I will. And that is a relevant test for us, not only as listeners, but as story writers. Something we forget in this digital age is that there are people that we're talking to. We talk about users, we talk about investors, we talk about customers, we talk about readers, we talk about audiences. But fundamentally, we are speaking to individual people in every case. That's the only way a conversion happens. And in order to invite them, to enlist them, to join us on the journey that we're on, we have to inspire them. We have to reach them on an emotional level. And the only way to do that is to be excited ourselves and to share that with them. I was giving an example earlier about your favorite singer who's on stage and calls it in, and it doesn't work. You can't think your way through your story. You can't perform your way through it. I actually saw a keynote about a month ago, and it was by a woman who was trying to tell us about some life lesson. And she was pretending to feel it. Her voice was going up and down. She was doing the gestures. I'd say about a quarter of the people walked out of the room, and it's because she wasn't actually feeling it. She was going through this performative motion, but without being there herself, and it didn't work. What I would say is when you got into a startup, you didn't realize you were signing up to be a performer, but that is in fact exactly what it is. And the only way to perform well is to feel it yourself every single time, which is actually why the job is exhausting. You're re-feeling your story whenever you tell it to an investor or a customer or the bank or a granting body, and that is in fact the job. So the 4 things that I think, there are many things that make a great story, but the 4 things that I think matter at an early stage of a startup are to remember that you are the storyteller in chief. You are the chief story officer, whether you're a founder, the CEO, or the person who goes out on behalf of your organization to enlist support and feedback. You're the chief story officer. That is the job. There's this simplicity paradox. What you do is complicated, and you have to find a way to make it simple without dumbing it down, without making it derivative. The third thing is there is a formula to write a good story. It's worth starting with one rather than reinventing the wheel, and remembering that the fact when it works, it's because of practice. And finally, there's no way around feeling it. A story only works when you do feel it. And you're now an actor. Congratulations. Hope you're writing a question down. I'm going to turn to talking about brand now, and then I want to hear all of your questions. So this is a bit of a leap, but I want to talk to you about the difference between a story and a brand. This is from a Marvel movie. The creative director at our agency, who's also now my life partner, is obsessed with Marvel. It is everywhere in my life. Here we go. I asked her for some art direction on the slide, and I was like, and it's Marvel, thank you. Most often, when people come to us, they tell us they need two things. They've mostly arrived at a place in the journey where they are no longer the only one out telling the story on behalf of the organization, and they've realized that the two people are actually telling pretty different versions of it, or that the sales team is telling it a different way. There's starting to be some kind of incongruency with the messaging. I'll say more about that that's going out. Or they realize they need a new website because they made it as a grad student at midnight one night using a Squarespace template. They just had to get it done, and they're like, an investor has told me we have to, or our mentor has told us we have to fix our website. Those are generally the two reasons. And I don't know how the word for this got around, but the code word is messaging. A lot of people come to me and say, I need messaging. And they have a wish. In fact, one client who came to us who was not a startup, they were actually quite a big mutual fund company, so it was quite surprising, said to me, I know this would never be you. We just have a small problem. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'd love to hear more about it. He said, people don't really understand what we do. I was like, okay, yeah, this is normal for people to come to me and say this. He said, all we need is a new homepage headline. I was like, oh, okay, well, that sounds really simple. He said, this is all we need. We just want people to understand what we do, what makes us different, what value they're gonna get at it, and just be really inspired so they get in touch, and when they get in touch, they just really already understand everything. And I was like, 3 word, do you feel like 3-word headline, or is it more like a 5-word headline? He was like, it's really simple. We don't need brand. We don't need brand. We don't need any of that. We just need a headline. And I was like, okay. We did a branding process. I definitely do a lot of magical thinking myself. We just moved offices. We had a huge number of cupboards and shelves that were absolutely full of books. And we're moving into another office that has one small cupboard, and I believed if I was organized enough, I could get everything into that cupboard. I just want to say I'm with you. I get it. I do get it. So I do want to show you what is working and what is not working about the concept of messaging and what it can do for you, because it's missing something important, which is where we start to get into this idea of brand. Imagine I was not here and I just put this up on the monitor and I was just kind of in another room over there. This is the start of my talk. It's amazing, right? Yeah, I know. So the big leap moment that I want to bring to you is that a big part of what brand is in creating the person who tells your story. Because the messages on their own don't inspire anybody. Messages need a teller, whether that is a person in real life, which is what it has often been for you since the beginning of your startup. Someone is out in person telling the story. That works. If there's a movie, someone's telling it. If there's a book, you've got a narrator. But messages on their own don't do that number one job, which is to inspire people. because the human brain doesn't process abstract things on its own very well. We need a person. Brand is partly about creating that storyteller, and it's also about collectively who you are, like your values, your beliefs, your vision, your value proposition, all of that. So it's not just about creating a person, it's about the storyteller and the story. But what I will say is at this stage it's rare for a company to need a full brand. I'm not suggesting you should invest in that now. It takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of money, and it's overkill. As Tom Urban reminded me last week, every startup is dealing at any time with 9 existential threats. And you can't overinvest in solving any of them. You have to solve each one just enough to keep going. So creating a full brand at this stage, in most cases, though not all, would be a wild overinvestment. But I do want to tell you what it will do, as I mentioned earlier, so that you can kind of have it in mind. So I'm going to tell you a bit about what a brand is and a few of its main components. So what's a brand? Well, if you look at these, you might think these are brands, and to some extent they are. These are logos. And interestingly, logos are mnemonics. And what that means is it's a visual memory trigger that reminds us of a whole many set of characteristics about a person or a company. It's a reminder, essentially. When you see a logo for a company you're familiar with, you might remember the interactions you've had with them, the product you had, the way something made you feel, but it triggers a whole world. So what we think about when we're designing a brand identity, a logo, colors, photographic style, that kind of thing, is first we consider who is that whole person. And if you're even just to look at this one image, you probably have a whole bunch of ideas and memories and assumptions about who this character is, what movies he's in, whether you like him or not, that kind of thing. So what we try to do is understand the whole person, and then we try to reduce it down to just the parts that we need to trigger that association and those memories. Because people are busy, they don't have a lot of time, we've got to make it simpler. And we can reduce it further and further and still have people understand what we're talking about. That is our goal, without going so far. That even one cue wrong triggers a whole different thing. So Interbrand, which is a very big agency that releases an annual report of the top brands in the world, released their most recent report, and these are the top. You probably won't be surprised. Number 1 is Apple, and then Microsoft, Amazon, Google, Samsung, Toyota, Coca-Cola, Mercedes, Disney, and Nike. Those are the top 10. You've heard of a few of them, I'm sure. And I'm not necessarily a fan of these companies, I'll be honest. I am a believer that small companies can be a lot more nimble. They can actually have a lot more impact, given the size that they are. But I think it's useful to pay attention and see what we can learn and use it towards the power of good. But Interbrand says that this year there has been an emergence of what they're calling a super league of brands. They're seeing a change in the brand ecosystem. And they said that the 10 brands I just read you are so well known now that their valuation is almost entirely based upon their reputation, not on their IP, not on their products. And I'm sure you've heard this number before, but they repeated it. Some estimates put their brand value at 80% or more of their valuation. That means how we perceive them, what we think about these companies, is why they are worth so much. And you are nowhere near this, but I wanted to pass it on to you that what they do is so far beyond product. They are about something, and then they have a product. And they can start another product and another one, but what we associate with them, in most of these cases, has nothing to do with a particular product anymore. Okay, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about where branding came from, because that will help us put together what's happening a little bit more. Branding came from cattle. You probably know this. When there were a lot of identical cows in a field, we had to have an ability to tell some from the other, which cows belong to one farmer and which to the other. So farmers develop very simple marks to help tell the difference in their animals, which I find super gross. But now we're at the point where most people in an average day see more than 6,500 brands without even noticing it. And that might be the brand on a chair or on the carpet or something on a room or the UPS truck or walking by a set of stores. There are so many of them that when we go to make a decision about a particular product, we have to use some of the impressions we've had because there are so many products. If I'm at the supermarket trying to choose between 14 different toothpastes, yes, I am a super nerd who reads the ingredients. I'm sure a lot of you are as well. But in some cases, the ingredients are the same. So how do I choose between those different toothpastes? And there are three ways, basically, that we now in this world have to make a decision between very similar seeming things. One of them is from old Sigmund, and he said, he had a quote, "The only thing we can feel is difference." You've heard this before from your mentors, that you have to define your value proposition and you have to have an awareness of what makes you different from other ways the same customer can solve the same problem. And brand starts with the idea of difference. Your audiences, whether it's investors, whether it's partners, whether it's talent, are choosing between you and some very similar startups. And what they're trying to figure out in order to do that is what makes you different. That's their job, whether they realize it or not. That's the way they're trying to assess. And they have less and less time, as we were saying. People, especially who come from science or product development, think that what matters is defining something about your product that is different from their competitor's product. And it does matter. But on the brand level, it doesn't matter. On the brand level, what matters is the different way it makes the person feel. It's some idea about who you are, as opposed to a feature or a rational difference. When we look at car brands, because car brands do this extremely well, is there anyone in this room, when they saw Volvo, if I ask you what does Volvo stand for, is there anyone who would not have said safety? Volvo's done a great job of having us understand that that's what they stand for. Ferrari, I mean, you can even see in the photo, it's like it's going so fast, there's like steam coming off it. We understand that's more about the passion of driving. Now, interestingly, they may actually spend more on brakes. Their brakes may be better than Volvo's, but Ferrari's not going to lead with a whole ad campaign about their brakes. It's just not how it goes, but Volvo might, and it's because of what Ferrari stands for versus Volvo. When we look at Tesla, innovation, the future. They've helped us understand what they're about, and that's a brand level value proposition as opposed to being about our product. So I know you know this already. These are little emojis. The way we find that is we start by thinking about what we offer and our purpose and our beliefs, everything that we're about. We do research to understand what our audiences are looking for and what they care about. That's back to the story of us being experts. And instead of talking about what interests us, figuring out what actually interests our audience, and figuring out what others offer, and finding this sweet spot between what we offer and what they're looking for, and no other people are claiming that they do. That's the job in identifying difference. And remembering that above all things, it's generally an idea or something about emotion. You don't need to do that yet. I'm just letting you know it's coming. Number 2, this is called Nobody Likes Cockroaches. Here's the idea. Nobody likes cockroaches. When you see them, they kind of scuttle around. They start, they stop. It makes us really uncomfortable as humans. We don't like that. They're not like snakes, they don't bite. They just skittle around. They're horrible. The biggest brands understand that. They understand that the human mind needs consistency. Consistency is what builds trust. If I see you 10 times in a row and you're essentially the same person, you're kind to me in the same way, you're wearing similar things, my brain starts to form a pattern about who you are and I trust you. The final rule, the final thing about what makes a good brand, and it goes back to a story Seth Godin tells, which is that if we go out in a given day and we see a cow in the field, chances are, unless you really like cows, you're not going to go home and tell anybody else about it. But if you see a purple cow in the field, you probably are going to tell somebody else. So the final thing that makes a brand really work is when there is something about what you're doing that makes somebody want to tell somebody else about it. People overinterpret that. They think you've got to do $1 million stunt, you've got to get your Cybertruck on stage and have people, shoot bullets at the bulletproof glass and have them actually break, and then it turns into a news story. You don't. It can be something really small about who you are. It can be an unlikely partnership that actually really works. It can be something really inexpensive, like a stunt McDonald's did at Halloween. It can be something clever. It can be something about your story. But there needs to be something about what you're doing that is remarkable. And remarkable doesn't mean cool. It means somebody wants to make a remark about you to somebody else. And that's one of the main things you're trying to build in as a brand, is having that be part of people's experience. It makes them look good, or it makes them look funny, or purpose-driven, or clever, or concerned about the environment to share this thing they found with somebody else. So those are the three things. You have to hone in on your distinctiveness, not just at the rational level, but at the emotional or conceptual level. You need to become deeply, deeply, reliably consistent, and there needs to be something about you that people want to share. The way you get there is always 5 steps. There's no agency in the world that has a different methodology. Some of them do each step differently, but fundamentally the approach is the same. You conduct a lot of research into yourself. What are your values and beliefs? What's your vision? What's your purpose? You get everybody together and you find that out. You research your competitors. What are they on the rational level? But also, what do they stand for? Where's that space for you? When you talk to your audiences, what are the jobs they're trying to do? What are the pain points they have? How can what you do solve what they need, rather than it just be you talking about what's interesting for yourself? So you conduct research, you define the value proposition, the purpose, the beliefs, the values, the reason to believe, the vision, the personality. What makes you different on a feeling level? And another way of thinking about that is a Mac versus a PC. They both make very different machines, but we understand right away that something is different about who they are. You design your strategy, who you're going to be, what you're going to stand for, what marketing you're going to do, for example. You design your identity, that's your logo, but also your photographic style, your colors, your look and feel. You don't need to do this yet, don't worry. You make the things that you need to make, and then you see how they're working all the time. You look at the data, the Google Analytics, Google Search Console, those kinds of things, but also you talk to people, just like I was telling you with the founder story. How is this resonating? What's our audience's perception of us? Is it working? Am I shifting their perception of who we are? Or am I just sort of generic? And then you learn as you go, you change it. And then of course, just like in real life, there needs to be a bit of guts, magic, and intuition. A little bit something more than getting everything right. That I wanted to share with you. I want to thank you for being so engaged, looking out at your faces. It's just lovely to be here talking to you. Thank you. And what I would like to do now is I would like to hear your questions. We have half an hour, and then I'm also going to give you my email at the end, so that if you think of something tonight when you're walking the dog or tomorrow, you can email it to me. But I would love to hear anything you're wondering about. I will try to answer it.
Gonna ask what AMA stands for.
Oh yeah, it's a Reddit thing. It means ask me anything.
Oh.
So, I mean, if you ask me about my dog, I will answer it, but it might be more interesting if it's about brand. Yes.
So I had a question about the brand consistency.
Mm.
So you mentioned how important it is, and big brands understand that consistency, is what kind of builds trust over time.
Yeah,
For startups, I think the situation is often we have to pivot.
yeah.
We find our footing in a market.
Mhm.
Takes years, hopefully not 30 years, but it can easily take 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I hope it's not 30.
And I imagine that during that time, a lot of startups actually change their branding.
Yeah.
And they say something like, well, the typical attitude is that, well, let's just have something now, quickly,
Yeah.
and then we can refine it later.
Yeah.
And they keep
I'm
refining
familiar.
it and refining it.
Yeah.
So what's your advice
Yeah.
about how to approach this? Like, should startups try to fix their branding early on and stick to it, or try to improve it over time?
Great question. I think when you're pivoting, you shouldn't try to fix your brand in a kind of a visual identity perspective. I think it's a waste because of how much you're learning. But I think there are things from the very beginning that should not change. Those are things like why you're doing it, what your values are, what your beliefs are, and to some extent your vision. I don't mean in a really technical, like BHAG sense or financial goal. Those should change. But it's something about your purpose, what you're trying to achieve in the world. And I think if you can get clear on those between yourselves early on, even if everything else changes, there's this core, this foundation that stays the same. Something that's really interesting about Nike is they actually defined the brand in the 80s when they were further along than a startup. But almost nothing about it has changed, and it's because they really thought about their values and beliefs, what they were in it for. And Nike was always in it to make the ordinary person a hero. It's this idea of authentic athletic performance. They make you bigger by doing this very ordinary thing, and that's never changed, and that's about a why. So I think if you can get that together as founders and all be talking from that playbook, it doesn't matter if a product changes or an audience or that kind of thing, because those are at that product level rather than the conceptual level.
So, as a brand agency, you probably come across most products.
Quite a few.
What happens if you come across a product that you've never dealt with before?
There are so many new categories all the time, and I feel like since the Red Bull story, where Red Bull invented a new category rather than coming out with another Coca-Cola or Pepsi, and by doing so they managed to charge 3 times the price and they became the first energy drink. I feel like almost every company we talk to tells us they want to create a new category. And I think, oh yeah, you go.
Why follow up? So, so let's say you have a product that is unknown.
Yeah.
And the agency comes along. How does the agency start to understand what it is they need to understand in order to then help brand it?
Great question.
Because unfortunately, we've been in that experience where we came to a branding agency and really they just simply struggled with their ability to articulate what it was we were doing and how it could set within the environment to appeal to all. I mean, it's there, but it's not catching.
That's interesting.
We've
Sam
done this
can't
4
speak.
times,
Oh,
and we spent a lot of money.
of course we know.
So again, sorry not to take up the gas in the room, but to me, it's more a philosophical, like how. Quick story, when iPhone 3 first released, what we don't know is that they spent upwards of about $50 million to get their brand to a point where we would understand what it was an iPhone did.
Yeah.
So there's a language which constitutes an education, and therefore we're appealing to the brand. Correct me if I'm wrong, but in order for them to get us to the place where we understood the product, they injected tons and tons and tons of money. But what happens when you have a product that is of the same comparative and your brand agency is struggling to even understand it themselves, let alone then articulate it?
Gosh, there's so many questions I would want to ask you about this to understand what happened.
Maybe
enjoy
later,
that.
like
My heart goes out to you. I feel like that's actually a really hard experience.
The only thing I would say on a simplistic level for the benefit of other people to do with this question of like, what if you invent a new category, is I would say that there's still the question of what are the other things your customers are doing to solve the same problem, which sometimes are completely different. Like when American Airlines did their branding, two of their main competitors were the bus and driving, because they were trying to invent a totally different kind of low budget airline. So it's not always like Concorde that you're competing against. I don't know if they did that. I don't know what their process was. I'm sorry. But I would say even if you're inventing a new category, there are ways of going about figuring out how to articulate who you are.
Oh, there are, we don't have a budget. I mean, that's the only thing I've worked out that actually is going to work in time, is that with enough time, with enough saturation, with enough education, the audience comes to meet the product from an understanding and therefore embraces what effectively is a product that will change the way we look at this product. It's not even me making it.
Love to talk to you more about that. Who else? Yeah, go ahead.
So,
Sorry, actually, all of the examples in your slides, they were products, like,
Yes.
Coca-Cola, Microsoft.
Yes, I can tell you why.
So I'm not asking what is the approach. I mean, what's the difference between technology and product, but do we have to follow the same rules, the same approach? For example, consistency, if you're talking about the technology, like blockchain versus Bitcoin, right? Consistency gives me the sense that you're kind of there is a threat that you're underestimating the capabilities in. Do you have any comment in that?
When you create a brand, you're trying to create something that's bigger than your products, that's a line that runs through all of them. So if you look at Apple's products, for example, there's, the virtual reality goggles, they work for B2B, they do B2C, they did the music stuff, they do TV, they're creating original content now. Like, each of these things is so different that we have to drill down on the value proposition of each of them to understand them. But there is something beyond that, which for Apple is revolutionarily simple. That's what they're about at a brand level. Whatever they tackle, they try to have a revolution in the way that they do it, so much simpler than anyone else. And that's true everywhere. So I would agree with you. Your products sometimes are very, very different, but we still need to find what runs through them. And it may not be time to do that yet, because you may not yet have thought about all the products that you're going to develop, or your services, or your verticals, or whatever else. You can only really think about that one product and maybe your values, beliefs, purpose, that kind of stuff. Yes.
So I have two questions. One, hopefully everybody can bend it a little bit. So when it comes to story, you mentioned the importance of having a good story and a storyteller. I'm a huge fan of, obviously, human interaction. That's the preferred communication method. But in order to scale, and most of us are in the scaling business, we resort to digital media. So what are effective ways to kind of digitally communicate your story and retain all of the elements that you
When you're at the point where you're trying to convey who you are by using images and words where there's no person present, that is when you're starting to think about brand. And I can't imagine you have the funds to invest in brand yet. I would at least try to think about defining, as we said, your values, beliefs, purpose, so that you've got those. Those can help you think a bit about what your personality should be in those kinds of digital communications. Are you doing something bold? Are you doing something fresh? Are you doing something poignant? Are you doing something very authoritative? It can help if you can think about that just a little bit, and it can inform what you're doing. There are actually 12 brand archetypes if you want to look them up. And something you can even do is you can think about which of these archetypes feels the closest to who we are. But beyond that, I would say at this stage, I would just try to be really clear in those communications that I'm putting out, rather than trying to get too complex. Just try not to make it too muddled. Try to tell a simple story.
So I do have a second question.
Okay.
So taking over a small business, albeit small, it has 33 years of history.
Wow.
So, and then I'm pondering the merging of the story. So as a new owner, I would bring my own story.
Yeah.
I mean, it happens to all companies, big or small, eventually you grow, you merge, you get acquired. So when that happens, how do you approach that?
It's a great question, and to me, it's no different than anything else that's gonna happen for you. And if you go back to the Pixar story, or to any good story, it's about a new change that happens, a new threat, a new difficulty, a new twist. Because of that, this is all about twists and new developments, and your story should keep going. So one of the twists becomes maybe the wonderful thing that led to this merging of the companies, or a problem that you had that led you to go out and seek an M&A to solve it, or there's some way that this then gets incorporated, what was good about it or what was difficult about it, what you've learned, and what it now means about what that right future is.
Hey, just a simple question for the process, at what point do we start thinking about design identity and creating touch points? As, we're all startups and we're all small, towards the end, do we progress to that stage?
Great. I think unless there's really gonna be a big ROI for you in investing in getting your identity done well, I think the best thing I would say is make it clean. Make it clean, find a template that is not embarrassing. No, I'm kidding. Find a template that, looks okay. You go on Squarespace or on WordPress and you look and you say, this feels a bit like us. I think this is gonna be fine for a while. And you try to use that typeface, you try to use that approach to images, and just try not to commit any major design crimes. Just try to keep it simple, keep it clean. Don't try to define it all on your own and get fancy. Pick something straightforward, Helvetica, Arial, use of big images, whatever it is, keep going until there's a real reason. And what I mean by that is, let's say you've had a round of funding and you need to reach a certain audience and you've got to get the word out there, and there's a potential for it to bring you a certain amount of money, and you realize that a spend on your visual identity can lead you as a cost of sale to be much more able to acquire that. Then it makes sense to do it. Before that, it makes us feel really good, but I wouldn't say it's a great business decision. So I would say clean, simple template that's usable. And you might be able to find a graphic designer who doesn't mind working hourly to help you tweak that template that you picked, for example, so that the way you add the image doesn't make it all fuzzy or whatever happens. That some clean and simple. Don't worry about being a bit generic.
I have a question regarding logo.
Yeah.
You look at some logos and they are kind of looks mystics. For instance,
There are mistakes in it, or they look like a mistake?
mystics.
Mystic.
Okay, like for instance, let me tell you. You look at the logo, I think it's Procter and Gamble.
Yeah.
It's a moon and a face on it and so on. And a face on a person on it. My question is that this kind of logo is good for startups or not?
I would give you the same advice. I don't know about this Procter and Gamble logo. It's probably not actually important to your question. I think I would give the same advice here as I gave to this gentleman, which is in the beginning, try to keep things simple. I'm not even sure you need a logo in the beginning. You might just need a word mark. You might just need to write the name of your company and use Helvetica or a very standard typeface in order to communicate it. And then it's as you get down the line and you know more about yourself that you can actually have a logo designed. It's still quite simple to change a logo. I don't know if anyone's ever seen Apple's first logo. Oh my gosh, it's like this super weird ornate tree in the Garden of Eden, and it's got like a serpent on it, and then it's like black and white. It's like a line drawing, and it's hard to even tell what it is. Like you've got to get really close, and you got to be like, is that a snake? And the other person's like, no, and you're like, oh yeah, you're right. Like it's awful, and you don't need to do that.
So Savior's logo.
Say again?
The Savior's logo is like an extra single character.
You don't need to to get ahead of yourself and think you've got to do something really fancy. Word mark is fine, or if you have a cousin who does logos and they want to do something really simple, but I would say keep that as simple as you can. Don't overcomplicate it yet.
My question is about the story, and in many startups there is something kind of disruptive, right?
Yeah.
So there is this state of things that was before, and then there is some disruption coming, and then there is a new equilibrium, as you mentioned.
A brave new world.
And it kind of aligns nicely with our kind of story, but then I thought, would it scare the potential customers? So,
This is such a great question.
I mean, we are in a very traditional industry, and this disruption is scary.
Yeah.
So you could say there is no way it doesn't come, if you just like join or cease to exist, but it's something negative, right? In this messaging.
I love this question. I have a two-part answer. The first is, I can't say enough how much I believe in audience interviewing. And I think when we think about that, we imagine big, complicated market research. I know E at UBC is a big fan of audience interviewing. There's that great book, The Value Proposition of Canvas. It has a really good example about it. I know sometimes we think about the Google Sprint methodology, which actually believes you can get the vast majority of an audience cross-section with 5 good interviews. It's not even that you have to overinvest. If you planned what you're gonna ask, you can get away with that and really get a read on what is this audience trying to solve, what are the pains for them, and you can read between the lines to understand what's their culture, how traditional are they, what are their emotions that are driving them to say these are their pain points. Is there a lot of fear going on? Is it more about excitement? Is it about pride? What's happening here? You can intuit that as a sensitive person. And I would say that's an extremely helpful thing. But the other thing I would say is back to that idea of practice. So armed with your knowledge about what the audience is, you write your story, practice it and watch. Are you scared in a good way? Am I scared that I made them think I'm a giant weirdo? Like, where is that line? And then, oh, now I'm not scaring them enough. Now they're a bit bored, need to amp it up a little bit. Then we try this new thing. And I mean it when I say hundreds of times. And I think you will get to a story, if you do that, that is scary in a good way, that has them feel the excitement of disruption without feeling like, oh, this is gonna wreck my world. So I wanna come to, so if someone hasn't asked you, go ahead.
So for this formula, I'm just wondering, applying to business.
Yeah.
So you talk about problem, like every day and one day. So the timing is critical for business. Like for internal problem, or external, like for example, AI, no matter it's how advanced, but people don't notice that. Now is the timing for AI.
Yeah.
So yeah, can you elaborate on that? How we tell the story, and like is that the difference between we need to amplify why the market need it now, not the internal of the CEO discover something, the scientist discover something for technical founder.
It's a lovely part of the story to add. And to me, that's a really big part of it. What happened internally that led us to it? What were the external factors that meant it was important to develop, either because something's wrong in the world or something's changed in the world? Because what you're doing is addressing those factors, and I think that's a lovely thing to add, especially if it means something to you or it was important in your story. Yeah, I think you're giving people the pieces to help them make sense of it. Yes.
My question's about when things go wrong, which, sorry to bring the mood down, but I've done a lot of I've done a lot of design work with clients where they come to me and say, we want to rebrand because things aren't going great. And a lot of my work has been with political parties. If you ever see a political party has changed their logo, it means they're not in a good place. But often the case is that what's wrong isn't the brand, and they've misidentified the problem. So what, in your experience, what are the things that brand and design can help fix, and what are the things it can't help fix?
such a lovely question. I would say that mostly people come to me and they tell me what they think they need. And I feel like my job is to actually find out what problems are going on in their business. And I think that's where any good design process starts, is getting a really detailed understanding of the problems. And they're often very different problems, and sometimes there's a line through them and sometimes there isn't. But I think that phase, the phase of problem identification, has to start, because you're right, brand may not be the problem at all. The messaging may not be the problem, the logo may not be the problem, the ad buy may not be the problem. We have to look at what's the actual business problem you're having. Interestingly, we had a client a few weeks ago, and they were telling us they needed a new one-pager. And they did it themselves in-house, and they went through like 17 rounds of this one-pager. Like, the internal cost of this thing was like, I don't know, tens of thousands of dollars. And in the end, they basically took all the copy off the website and they put that on a one-pager. That's how many rounds they had gone. So they now had the website copy on a PDF that they were sending to people. And they came and they said, we need a new one-pager. And I was talking to them about what was coming up. And what was coming up was clearly a sales problem. It had nothing to do with needing a new piece of marketing material. And we actually, not that I'm brilliant, but together, when we were talking, we actually pretty quickly identified what was going wrong with that. And I think unless you do that, any work is wasteful.
I forgot, what was that book that you mentioned from,
Oh, I always call him Alexander Osterweiner, but it's Alexander Osterfelder. Oh my God, I forgot. The Value Proposition Canvas.
The Value Proposition.
Yeah. Am I getting that right?
Ostermeyer.
Thank you. Ostermeyer. That's where I go wrong. He was doing a PhD in at MIT, and he studied a whole range of disruptive companies and what they had in common. And he determined that they had a few things in common. One was this research process to determine what does the audience of their jobs and pains, what's the competition stand for, how does this solve a problem, how is there a product market fit, as opposed to it just being like, hey, we made a product, it's amazing, but what does the audience actually need? Thinking about them first when you think about the product. It's nice, it's simple.
Quick question.
Yes, and then I want to actually go to this guy first and I'll come back. Go ahead.
Well, first, thank you so much for so much jam-packed information. It was incredibly valuable. I want to take us back a moment to the beginning. And you were talking about scientists.
When I was in Silver Spring.
That's right. 4 years old. Scientists, founders, storytellers.
Yeah.
And you explained that they would tell you what they thought was so interesting about their product or their startup story.
Yeah.
And how you said that was really the case. And of course, if we could all have...
It was really interesting
for them,
That's
right?
not wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Good point. Of course, we could all have Vanessa in our back pocket as our fractional chief storytelling officer and problem solved. Feeling that, how would you suggest that founders here think about bridging that disconnect between our perception, which is often now very limited, we don't know what we don't know, and we can't see your objective perception. So our perception of what's interesting, and bridge that with your objective perception of what's interesting. And I'm not calling it reality on purpose.
My reality and your reality.
So how do we do that ongoingly?
Yeah.
So that we can reconnect with the audience that we want to connect with versus what we think is interesting and be lost in our own world?
It's a really great question. I think we're all guilty of being lost in our own world. I think we also seek reassurance too that the world that we're living in is the right world. I mean, I'm not even going to get started on the echo chambers in the States right now, but it's what's happening. We find ways to reinforce our own beliefs about the world, whether that's talking to other experts or whatever it is. But I think, though I'll sound like a broken record, I think it is about having regular contact with our audience in ways that we're subtly researching them, whether it's a formal research call that's 15 minutes long to check what's changed for them in their world with their jobs and their pains and that kind of thing,
But I think it's also just being out as much as we can, talking to people, covertly researching, covertly interviewing them. I don't mean for the purposes of evil, I just mean for our own understanding and checks. And also that we're constantly practicing our story on new people and really watching them. Not just hoping they got it, but really paying attention to the way they're responding to what we're saying. And using that as kind of it's an exercise. It's like meditating, you never get done with it. You're not like, good, set it and forget it, I've got the story. That never happens. It's a daily practice of keeping the story fresh, staying aware of our surroundings and of us inside what's coming up. How does that feel? Does it feel okay?
I think it's good.
I want to come back to people who have a second question, but who else didn't ask a question you didn't ask?
It's following Jake's question. You're a medical company, so sometimes there is a dissonance between regular audience wants to hear and what doctors want to hear.
Yeah.
And you lose credibility when you're trying to make it easier for the broader audience.
Yeah. It's a great question.
It's a challenge.
Sometimes there's a way to vary the same story for a different audience. So what I mean by that is, Apple does a beautiful job of this. If you look at one of Apple's computers and you look at the B2B site versus the B2C, they're talking about it in a different way. And that's normal. We all have to do that based upon the audience that we're speaking to. And as you're saying, a medical practitioner is going to have different informational needs from a patient. And that's about that audience research and meeting them where they are and telling the same story but in a different way. There is one step beyond that. It's rare, but sometimes as a company you get to a place where you realize two of your audiences are in direct opposition to each other. It's very rare. We worked for a company, for example, where they were doing technology design at a very sophisticated level, things like prisons or universities or whole new developments. And then they also had electrical engineers in-house, and they were trying to message about both of those things. But they were losing jobs for the technology design because those clients thought of them as tradespeople. And then they would go to someone else that they thought was more sophisticated. So there are occasionally times where the same company has to be split in half in order to be able to serve its audiences. Very rare. Do not attempt this at home. I'm just saying sometimes you realize you fixed everything else and you're banging your head into a wall, and that can be a variable. But in over 99% of cases, it's about realizing that when you tell the story to your mom versus your kid versus a colleague versus another scientist, you're always adapting it slightly, and it's the same thing as a brand. That is part of what you have to do.
Yeah, so just being cognizant of time. I know some people have other events that are going forward. I just wanted to thank Vanessa for coming, and it was so lovely to have you here. Yes, that's right. So it'll be wonderful if anyone had any questions that didn't have answered, you can use this time to talk with her. And one thing I just wanted to share with you before we finish is people had some questions around communication when what you have is very disruptive or people feel really uncomfortable. So I just wanted to share something with you around how sometimes if you can help the audience actually have an epiphany in real time with you, that can get them to change their thinking. So I'll give you two examples of that. So one is I was giving a presentation to a very conservative audience. It was an international audience in the US at a transportation conference, very focused on rail and hard infrastructure. And I was telling the story about how different groups interact with and perceive a traditional company like rail, which is older than Canada. And that it goes through more than hundreds and hundreds of First Nation Indigenous communities across Canada. But for Indigenous communities, the way they perceive this company is completely different. It's the last generation that was putting them on a scene of rail because we are so pleased to do it. So, and we have another example from one of our teams that collaborated with the research-based theater company, and they were doing a water treatment in an Indigenous community to be able to bring drinking water into that community. And one of the ways they helped communicate how how transformative it was for the community to get this, this resource, but how complicated the process was, is they engaged with this drama group, these playwrights, and they created this monologue from the point of view of a water technologist who was Indigenous, and he talked about how the elders in the community were really concerned when the only way to get training was to leave the community. So education then became very fearful, and then he talked about being able to come back and how much pride he had to be able to give water to his community, and that helped to transform people's view of what education meant. So certain things in one culture would have a very strong, positive characteristic, could be quite different for within another culture because of various reasons. So if you can create some sort of epiphany happening in the audience at the time, you can help with understanding things. So just wanted to thank Vanessa again and encourage you to ask questions. So thank you all.
Thank you so